The sun, a brutal, unforgiving brass disk hanging low over the Mekong Delta, marked the 27th of October, 1944. The air thick, not with mist, but with the humid chemical decay of a war already lost, though no one inside the low, corrugated tin barracks of the temporary holding pen would dare utter such a treasonous thought. Lieutenant Colonel Takamatsu, a man whose features had been worn down to the hard, unyielding geometry of granite by 6 years of endless imperial campaigns, sat on an ammunition crate beneath the inadequate shelter of a tattered canvas fly, his khaki uniform bleached nearly white by the relentless Indo-Chinese heat. He was surrounded by his logistics and command staff, all men equally gaunt and equally possessed of the singular, pathological focus that only profound, long-term scarcity could breed. They were gathered not for a strategy session, for strategy was now a grim joke played by distant, irrelevant generals, but for a moment of shared, dark irony, a brief respite of derision aimed at the two entities they saw as equally contemptible, the weak, captured French and the clumsy, overfed Americans. The lieutenant colonel held a thick, cloth-bound ledger, its pages crisp despite the humidity, filled with a precise, almost loving Japanese calligraphy. This book, he explained to his subordinates, was the latest acquisition in their inventory, a list of the 69 French women, captured after the latest clumsy resistance actions and the surrender of a minor colonial outpost, all of them now officially categorized and inventoried. Takamatsu let out a dry, rasping sound that was the closest he ever came to laughter. The men around him joined in, a chorus of hacking mockery. Their humor was fixed on the utter, predictable cultural incompetence of the enemy they now awaited. They spoke of the French officers who had whined about the absence of Pinard wine and of the expected American invasion, not a stealthy maneuver, but a clumsy, corpulent landing of men who smelled of chewing gum and canned ham, men whose entire industrial philosophy was visible in the absurd, wasteful weight of their flying machines. The Americans, they scoffed, would surely treat these captured women as heroes, as ladies, as prizes of war to be paraded, failing to grasp the mathematics of their true value. They are inventory, Takamatsu finally declared, tapping the cover of the ledger with a meticulously clean fingernail, his voice low but sharp enough to cut the humid air. Meat for the slaughter, yes, but more importantly, a fungible resource. The lieutenant colonel's rhetorical point was precise and devastating. This meticulous ledger, with its columns detailing age, height, and perceived compliance, was a perfect microcosm of the imperial system. It was not merely an act of cruelty, it was an act of industrial management born of scarcity. In a nation starved of steel, oil, and manpower, where every resource was husbanded and cannibalized for the war effort, even human dignity became a commodity to be exploited and cataloged until it was utterly exhausted. This was the fundamental ideological difference between them and the Americans. The Japanese Bushido ideal is underpinned by industrial austerity and the mathematics of scarcity. 1,000 miles eastward from the pathetic ledger of Lieutenant Colonel Takamatsu, where human lives were meticulously accounted for as disposable assets, the true engine of defeat roared into the thin, sun-drenched air above the Philippine Sea. It was the afternoon of the 9th of November, 1944, and Lieutenant Commander Dale Whiskey Donovan of Fighting Squadron 12 was strapped into the cockpit of his Grumman F-6F Hellcat, an aircraft so aggressively designed for survival and mass production that enemy pilots initially dismissed it as a corpulent whale. This machine, often derided by the aesthetically focused engineers of the Reich and the Empire as a flying milk bottle, was in fact the perfect, uncompromising physical manifestation of the American industrial philosophy, the relentless, overriding belief in the Mao mathematics of abundance. Juxtaposed against Donovan's bulky, durable fighter was the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0, a machine born of the opposing doctrine, the mathematics of scarcity. The Zero was a beautiful, sleek, almost artisanal katana of the air, achieving impossible performance through the savage, fanatical deletion of everything deemed inessential, including the pilot's armor, self-sealing fuel tanks, and structural redundancy. It was a craft designed for the perfect, decisive moment, requiring an almost superhuman skill to fly, for it afforded its occupant almost no margin for error or forgiveness in the face of combat damage. The Zero's lightness, its speed, and its maneuverability were paid for in the cheapest commodity the imperial system had left, the lives of its highly trained pilots. But the American Hellcat and its terrifying stablemate, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, were monuments to a different kind of calculation entirely. The Thunderbolt, a behemoth of aeronautical engineering, tipped the scales at an unthinkable 17,000 pounds. Fully loaded, a staggering tonnage of steel, aluminum, and copper that no German or Japanese logistics chain could have ever conceptually accommodated. To the engineers in Tokyo, this weight was not engineering. It was an obscene industrial joke, an unnecessary luxury. But to Donovan and the growing number of American pilots, that weight was life itself, armor plate thicker than a man's thumb, and a visceral, crushing firepower that required no finesse, only proximity and volume. The difference was starkly illustrated by the sheer destructive potential mounted on the American wings. Where the Zero carried two 20mm cannon firing precious, meticulously crafted shells designed to conserve material, the later models of the Hellcat were armed with 6 Browning M2 heavy machine guns, each capable of spitting 6,000 rounds per minute. A 50 caliber slug, an avalanche of steel and lead that transformed any enemy aircraft into burning debris in less than a second of continuous fire. This was not precision warfare. This was saturation, a simple, brutal industrial application of overwhelming, redundant force. When a Japanese shell inevitably connected with Donovan's Hellcat, and the Japanese pilots were masters of gunnery, the plane did not explode in the catastrophic fashion of the fragile Zero. The self-sealing fuel tanks, a seemingly small technical detail which required immense internal scaffolding and rubberized sheeting, stanched the inevitable leaks of 80-octane gasoline. The heavy armor plating behind Donovan's seat absorbed the impact with a metallic thud that only rattled his teeth rather than ending his life. The Hellcat was engineered to shrug off damage, to absorb the full cost of the enemy's best effort and continue the fight, a corpulent beast designed not to win a duel, but to endure a sustained beating. This durability was not a function of superior genius, it was a function of unlimited resources. The decision to build a fighter that weighed 17,000 pounds was the decision of a society that could mine, smelt, refine, and ship the components without constraint. The decision to arm it with 6,000 rounds per minute of ammunition was the decision of a logistical system that could afford the strategic waste of expenditure for the tactical certainty of destruction. Donovan, sighting a nimble Zero flashing across the canopy, pressed the firing button. The noise was a concussive thunderclap. the barrels vomiting streams of tracers that looked like ropes of incandescent light, and within moments, the sleek, beautiful, but structurally austere Zero became a falling torch. That was the ultimate lesson of the Pacific Air War. The conflict was never about the individual pilot's skill, but about the unapologetic military business history, written by Detroit and Willow Run. The Americans came to the fight strapped not to a fragile katana of the air, but to a locomotive of unstoppable industrial might, a force whose sheer, overwhelming production figures rendered the Japanese philosophy of scarcity obsolete and terminal before the first shot was ever fired. The relentless, unforgiving reality of the war was not decided in the desperate, close-in maneuvering of a lone fighter pilot, but in the echoing, cathedral-like silence of a single American factory on the outskirts of Detroit. To fully grasp the nature of the crushing defeat that awaited Lieutenant Colonel Takamatsu, one had to move past the visceral terror of the dogfight and into the serene, pristine, fluorescent-lit interior of the Willow Run bomber plant in Michigan, a facility whose existence was itself a monument to unlimited resources and an industrial philosophy of abundance. Here, on a Tuesday morning in May 1944, the war machine moved with a rhythmic, almost meditative grace. The camera's gaze fixes on Eleanor, a woman whose strength was not forged in the crucible of combat, but on the monotonous, exhausting certainty of the assembly line. She stands dwarfed, yet central, against the immense scale of the consolidated B-24 Liberator, an aircraft that was less a machine and more a flying testament to American might. Her task this hour is singular, riveting the wing spar of the bomber. This seemingly trivial, repetitive action is the key to the ultimate inevitable victory, for the true secret of the Liberator was the geometry of the rivet. An average B-24 required the insertion and securing of approximately 1.5 million rivets across its expansive airframe, a figure so immense it became less a structural requirement and more a metaphor for the sheer, indefensible volume of work the Axis could never counter. This overwhelming numerical fact stood in direct, brutal contrast to the fragmented, artisanal nature of Japanese aircraft manufacturing, where the skilled laborer was a bottleneck, where raw materials were rationed, and where machines were often handmade, not mass-produced. The imperial system valued the quality of the individual component, the finesse of the craftsman, demanding scarcity and meticulous detail. The American system, however, valued the ungodly speed of production, viewing the aircraft itself as a fungible asset, its inevitable loss already accounted for by the endless stream following behind it. This was not a competition of engineering skill, but a pitiless contest of industrial throughput. While the German Luftwaffe struggled to maintain a fractured, dispersed production schedule, and the Japanese relied on increasingly obsolete, hand-finished airframes due to a chronic choke point in material supply, Eleanor and her fellow workers were performing an industrial miracle under a single gargantuan roof. Willow Run, which initially took months to produce its first bomber, eventually achieved the impossible: one completed B-24. Rolling off the line every single hour, this was the final, devastating, statistical reveal that Lieutenant Colonel Takamatsu could not possibly comprehend, for it transcended conventional military analysis. The United States, from the start of the war to its end, constructed over 19,000 Liberators and their variants. To be precise, the primary production lines delivered a staggering 12,000 B-24 heavy bombers. Let the weight of that number sink. 12,000 flying fortresses, each capable of carrying 8,000 pounds of high explosives across transoceanic distances, each built with 1.5 million rivets. This single, overwhelming data point, the output of one nation's heavy bomber program, exceeded the total number of primary fighter aircraft, Zeros and their direct successors, that the entire Japanese empire, operating at a state of fanatical total war, could manage to build throughout the entire 6 years of the conflict. The contrast was not one of margin, but of absolute, annihilating scale. This was the true force driving the war, not the courage of a man, but the mathematics of destruction. Inherent in the sheer, overwhelming, awe-inspiring numbers pouring forth from the American industrial heartland. The geometry of Eleanor's rivet was, in the end, the inescapable mathematics of defeat for the Axis powers. The mathematical proof of Axis defeat was not confined to the geometry of the aluminum rivet. It extended deep into the very bedrock of the two societies, pitting Japan's grim, finite supply against America's dizzying, seemingly infinite barrel. The logistical chasm separating the two combatants was so vast that it redefined the very meaning of warfare, transforming it from a contest of arms into a brutal, unequal attrition of resources. The American war effort was built upon a mountain of oil, a flowing, bottomless river of gasoline that powered the some 17,000-pound Thunderbolts and kept the B-24 fleet aloft. The Bonn Data Exposition reveals the true scale of this fundamental advantage. In 1944, the United States of America produced an astonishing 1.8 billion barrels or more of crude oil, an overwhelming percentage of which was refined, transported, and consumed by the war machine. This capacity to burn, to consume, to waste fuel on a scale previously unimaginable was the ultimate, unapologetic, military, business history of the conflict. To the Germans, whose tank divisions crawled toward the front on synthesized fuels scraped together from coal, and to the Japanese, whose surviving fleet was often tethered to port due to a lack of petroleum, this American extravagance was less an advantage and more a cosmic joke. This abundance filtered down to every anonymous figure in the American war effort. Consider the nigh juxtaposition of scales. The daily ration of a single nameless American private first class, packaged, caloric, and utterly dependable, was a logistical monument. It was a luxury that, when calculated across the hundreds of thousands of men deployed across the Pacific, represented a greater, more sustainable, caloric commitment than the entire fractured monthly supply chain could consistently deliver to the frontline elements of a major Japanese field army. The American soldier moved, fought, and survived on a foundation of absolute, guaranteed supply. The Japanese soldier fought on faith, on fanaticism, and on the ever-present, chilling knowledge of scarcity. But oil was useless without the means to move it, and here, the American industrial supremacy found its most terrifying physical form: the Liberty ship. These utilitarian, welded cargo vessels were the ultimate expression of the mathematics of abundance. Designed for simplicity and maximum throughput, they were built at a staggering, unbelievable pace. The American shipyards, adopting assembly line techniques to turn out 10,000-ton behemoths, launched over 2,700 of these ships throughout the war. This was not merely shipbuilding. This was the printing of resources. The sheer indefensible number meant that the American logistical chain could absorb the inevitable, painful losses inflicted by German U-boats or Japanese submarines and still see the flow of goods or increase. The capacity to lose 50 ships and immediately launch 60 more shattered the primary strategic doctrine of the Axis powers: attrition warfare. The Liberty ships carried the steel for the tanks, the parts for the 12,000 liberators, the uniforms, the ammunition measured in billions of rounds, and critically, the 80-octane gasoline that kept the American logistical machine moving at a pace the enemy could never match. The vastness of this tonnage, the sheer industrial weight being hurled across two oceans, served as the ideological hammer that will eventually break the enemy. Lieutenant Colonel Takamatsu, meticulously cataloging the lives of women in a desperate act of control, was operating under the delusion that skill, courage, and fanaticism could somehow compensate for the absence of this immense, physical, moving mountain of American industrial output. He failed to realize that the fundamental, technical struggle was already decided not by tactical brilliance, but by the overwhelming, undeniable power of the infinite barrel and the factory floor. The war was no longer about fighting. It was about the crushing, overwhelming cost of the shipping tonnage and the unlimited resources that underpinned it. The shadow of the coming avalanche of steel and lead had yet to fall upon the temporary holding pen, but Lieutenant Colonel Takamatsu could already feel the tectonic shift of the war, a pressure exerted not by brave infantry, but by the relentless, overwhelming production figures of his distant enemy. He sat once more on the upturned crate, but the earlier, brittle laughter had vanished, replaced by a grim, funereal stillness. The tropical heat, which had once felt merely oppressive, now seemed suffocatingly wan to tense, a physical manifestation of his final, doomed position. He was not reviewing maps, nor was he issuing last-minute tactical orders. He was performing an act of final, pathological organization, meticulously reviewing the infamous ledger, the inventory of shame that detailed the 69 captured French women. The cloth-bound book, stained at the edges with sweat and the faint scent of mildew, was his last link to the defeated but still perfect ideology of imperial control. This ledger was not merely a record, it was a devastating artifact of the scarcity of soul that his empire's industrial philosophy had created. If steel, rubber, and oil were finite resources, then, by extension, human beings became equally unfungible assets, or disposable units whose only value resided in their utility to the war machine. The women listed within, detailed, quantified, and assigned, were a logical, if chilling, consequence of a system that demanded total austerity and viewed compassion as a resource expenditure that could not be afforded. The very existence of this meticulous, institutionalized cruelty stood as the ultimate, somber moral cost of operating under the constant constraint of the mathematics of scarcity. Takamatsu's system, which had failed to produce sufficient aircraft or fuel, had perfectly succeeded in reducing human dignity to a line item. The air around the camp began to vibrate with a low, distant drone, the sound of the approaching, corpulent whale aircraft, each one a flying monument to industrial abundance. Takamatsu's gaunt, hardened face betrayed no emotion, but his movements were imbued with the final, desperate fanaticism that only the knowledge of utter failure can bring. His entire logistics chain, his command philosophy, the very premise of his service, that sacrifice could defeat surplus, had proven false under the crushing weight of the 1.8 billion barrels of American oil and the 2,700 Han Liberty ships. In a final ritualistic act, the colonel began preparing his men for the Banzai charge. This was not a tactical move designed to win ground. It was a sacred, ideological commitment, a final, screaming protest against the reality of American industrial capacity. He distributed the last, pitiful reserves of ammunition, detailing the glorious, inevitable death they would face. He spoke of honor and the purity of the spirit, knowing that these words were the only commodity he had left in supply. The juxtaposition of scales was now terminal, unforgiving. Lieutenant Colonel Takamatsu knelt in the red dust, whispering a final prayer to his ancestors, a deeply spiritual plea for the strength to face inevitable oblivion. His entire world was contracting down to a final, perfect moment of self-immolation. Simultaneously, a mere 50 miles offshore, the immense American armada was performing its final preparations, a machine of such scale that its components seemed to exist purely to absorb unimaginable volumes of energy. In the holds of the ships, millions of gallons of high-octane aviation fuel were being pumped into the reservoirs of the aircraft carriers, and further millions of gallons of diesel were being forced into the tanks of the approaching landing craft, an act of such staggering, casual, wasteful abundance that it mocked the very notion of austerity. Takamatsu was trading his life for a point of honor. The Americans were trading millions of gallons of fuel for the certainty of overwhelming total destruction. The colonel's fanaticism was born of our scarcity. The American approach was born of a resource overflow so great it made their victory mathematically predetermined. The trivial detail of the ledger, the itemized shame of the French women, was now positioned on the precipice of its own cosmic significance, ready to be revealed by the moral consequence of the approaching avalanche of steel. The silence of the jungle camp, the grim resolve of Lieutenant Colonel Takamatsu, was shattered not by rifle fire, but by the overwhelming, concussive arrival of the American logistical engine. It began with a sound like the world being violently torn in two, the thunderclappings of the heavy naval bombardment, a sustained, rhythmic percussion of 16-inch shells that transformed the meticulously drawn Japanese defensive lines into smoking, incomprehensible rubble. The sound was not the crackle of battle. It was the roar of industrial capacity, made manifest, the unmistakable voice of a society that could afford to hurl mountains of high explosives with such casual, overwhelming volume. The ensuing landing was not a penetration. It was an avalanche of steel and lead, thousands of men and hundreds of tracked vehicles pouring onto the shore, consuming terrain with the speed and certainty of a mathematical function. Private First Class Miller, 20 years old and perpetually chewing gum, was among the first wave of infantry to push inland, his Mawantong Garand rifle feeling like a natural extension of his arm. Miller was an anchor for the abundance of the American system. His uniform was clean, his pouches were stuffed with unlimited ammunition, and his pack contained not only his daily ration, but also the comforting, disposable detritus of an affluent society. He was, fundamentally, a man accustomed to my surplus. He moved through the wreckage of the Japanese outpost, the air thick with pulverized concrete and the acrid scent of cordite. His training focused on neutralizing the last pockets of fanatical resistance, the aftermath of the colonel's doomed Banzai charge. It was in the remains of the low tin barracks that the tense human peril abruptly gave way to a moment of profound, confusing stillness. Emerging from the choking smoke and the pulverized timber, blinking against the sudden, shocking tropical sunlight, were women. Not the local villagers, whom Miller had been trained to regard as either neutral or potentially hostile, but women whose skin and dress were unmistakably European, French. They were gaunt, their clothing threadbare, their eyes wide with a mixture of terror, expectation, and an utterly defeated resignation. Miller froze, his rifle momentarily lowered, the juxtaposition of scales, intensely personal, the immense 17,000-pound weight of the war machine had delivered him, a solitary private, to this quiet, devastating scene. The women emerging from the inventory of shame. Of Lieutenant Colonel Takamatsu's ledger had only one frame of reference for their immediate future, the brutal, utilitarian logic of sea scarcity they had just endured. They expected the brusque command, the summary dismissal, the view of them as damaged goods, used, exploited, and now simply a logistical problem to be filed away or discarded. They steeled themselves for the cold, unfeeling bureaucracy of liberation, preparing for judgment from the victorious men. But Miller, a product of the assembly line that produced 12,000 bombers, a system that could expend extraordinary resources to save a single downed crew, valuing every component, every citizen, did not see an object, a liability, or a victim to be catalogued. He saw, through the fog of war, a human being. He moved toward the nearest woman, a trembling figure whose exhaustion was profound, and offered her his full canteen. His own thirst ignored for the moment. The words that left his lips were utterly free of judgment, scorn, or the dark humor of contempt. He spoke with the automatic, deeply ingrained courtesy of a society so rich in material goods that it could afford the luxury of moral abundance. He simply said, "Ma'am, are you hurt, ma'am?" The silence that followed was absolute. The women, who had braced for the ultimate reduction of their personhood, were instead addressed with the highest possible term of civilian respect. French, comfort girl, POWs were surprised when American troops called them ma'am. The shock was palpable, the utterly counterintuitive scenario manifesting in the wreckage. That single simple word, ma'am, became the statistical reveal, more profound than any number of rivets or barrels of oil. It was the thesis proven. The defeated fanatical ideology of high scarcity had reduced human beings to line items in a ledger. The victorious, relentless ideology of industrial abundance had afforded them dignity, seeing the individual first and the circumstances second. The capacity to wage war on a scale of 1.8 billion barrels and wands of oil had birthed a moral foundation that the enemy, trapped in their self-imposed scarcity, could never comprehend. The difference between the ledger and the address of "Ah, ma'am" was the difference between the doomed and the destined, the cruel mathematics of imperial failure, and the moral abundance of unstoppable American industrial might. The reverberation of Private First-Class Miller's single word, "Ma'am," echoed far beyond the humid wreckage of the remote camp, crystallizing the entire global conflict into a single, devastating data point. This moment of unexpected courtesy was not a spontaneous, isolated act of decency. It was the inevitable, structural byproduct of a civilization operating in ideological overdrive, a civilization founded upon the very mathematics of abundance. The narrative now shifts entirely to the authoritative, analytical voice, interpreting this simple linguistic exchange as the ultimate proof of the war's underlying industrial thesis. The Axis powers, particularly the Imperial Japanese regime, had embraced a philosophy of scarcity as both a material reality and a moral imperative. When resources are finite, Every calculation becomes zero-sum. If steel is scarce, armor must be stripped from the fighter plane. If food is scarce, rations must be stolen or forgone. And critically, if human life is scarce, the dignity of that life is the very first component to be sacrificed and converted into raw utility. The ledger meticulously maintained by Lieutenant Colonel Takamatsu, detailing the captured French women as fungible assets, was the tragic, logical conclusion of a system that lacked the industrial capacity to sustain either its war machine or its morality. The system that could not produce enough oil to move its fleet must inevitably resort to moral austerity, consuming its own people and its victims without conscience. The women's profound shock upon hearing the respectful address was the ultimate statistical proof of this moral vacuum. They had been conditioned to expect the logic of the scarcity, the assumption that their suffering and utilization were necessary, unavoidable components of the war machine. Instead, they encountered the product of an unlimited resources doctrine. The American soldier could afford his decency in the same way the American shipyards could afford Iman to launch over our 2,700 Liberty ships. This is the concept of the high tonnage of morality, the notion that a society possessing the logistical capacity to manage 1.8 billion barrels of annual oil production, dedicating immense energy to saving the individual, necessarily possesses the moral bandwidth to extend fundamental respect even to the most marginal figures of the conflict. The moral and the industrial are indivisible. They are two sides of the same coin of abundance. The system that committed to building 12,000 B-24 liberators to ensure the overwhelming victory, an act of such staggering waste and volume it became a strategic weapon, is the exact same system that conditioned Private First Class Miller to see an individual worthy of the address. Ma'am. The American unlimited resources philosophy did not merely enable victory, it demanded a different kind of moral posture. When the industrial base can replace materiel faster than the enemy can destroy it, the focus shifts from conservation of resources to the conservation of the human capital that runs the machine. This ideological overdrive provided a fundamental, terrifying contrast into the Japanese ideal of the single, fanatical warrior. The Japanese system failed because it bet everything on the scarcity of resources and the purity of spirit. The American system won because it drowned the spirit in an ocean of steel, lead, and gasoline, preserving the dignity of its soldier, and by extension, the dignity of those it liberated. The private, who spoke that single word, ma'am, was less an individual and more a walking, uniformed representation of a trillion-dollar economy. The system that built the corpulent whale of the Hellcat also built the ethical framework that allowed for a moral abundance that the bankrupt enemy could only stare at in dumbfounded terminal defeat. The message was clear, delivered not through a diplomatic cable, but through the overwhelming, brutal fact of an overwhelming courtesy. The mathematics of defeat was not just a tally of lost tanks and sunken ships, but the final, complete collapse of an ideology rooted in the fundamental flaw of scarcity, the destructive capacity unleashed by the unlimited resources of the American industrial heartland was not reserved merely for the crumbling periphery of the Pacific theater. Its full, terrifying weight was simultaneously being leveraged over the fractured, desperate skies of the Reich. Here, the conflict manifested as the ultimate, unforgiving test of skill against scale, pitting the last remnants of German aviation genius against the relentless, indifferent, overwhelming tonnage hurled from the transatlantic production lines. Major Erich Hartmann, the most decorated pilot in history, represented the apex of the doctrine of scarcity in aerial combat, his Messerschmitt Bf 109. A featherweight marvel of precision engineering designed for the quick, decisive kill, dependent on the individual brilliance of its pilot to conserve both ammunition and machine. But even Hartmann's peerless skill was a candle flame against the rising tide of gasoline and steel. To the Major and his comrades, the American bomber fleets were not mere formations of aircraft. They were hammers from heaven. Dark, segmented clouds of metal that moved with the unstoppable inertia of a geological event, utterly indifferent to the valor or desperation of the lone fighter attempting to penetrate their defenses. This was the terrifying consequence of the mathematics of abundance. The ability to flood the skies with so many machines that the tactical loss of any single aircraft became a tolerable, budgeted expense. The American doctrine of precision bombing. A concept laughed at in the early years of the war was now brutally effective, enabled not by perfect optics, but by the sheer industrial volumes of its application. The primary hammer of this doctrine was often the consolidated B-24 Liberator, the same aircraft whose 1.5 million rivets. An astronomical production run had been forged in the serene fluorescent light of Willow Run. German pilots, struggling with fuel shortages and chronic spare parts deficits, the structural hallmarks of a collapsing system rooted in industrial austerity, would often describe the spectacle with a terrifying sense of awe-inspiring tone scale. A German farmer's son, pulled into the Luftwaffe as an anonymous defender, would climb to altitude and see a terrifying visualization of the juxtaposition of scales. His nimble yet fragile fighter set against a diamond formation of 17 B-24s. Each machine a self-contained fortress, bristling with the 6,000 rounds per minute firepower of American AW-50 caliber machine guns. He was the product of a bankrupt ideology. They were the product of the infinite barrel. The weight of the destruction was the true measure of American industrial capacity. The Allies were dropping bombs measured not in kilograms, but in megatons of high explosives and incendiaries, systematically dismantling the very factories, rail lines, and oil synthesis plants, the last struggling vestiges of the German war machine that were supposed to sustain men like Hartmann. The scale was relentless, and the strategy was clear: to use abundance to crush opposition. The American capacity for wasteful expenditure, the ability to pour endless streams of 80-octane gasoline into the fuel tanks and hurl countless tons of munitions downrange, was the ultimate indefensible weapon against a nation focused on the careful, measured conservation of its limited resources. Hartmann's skill could down 3 or 4 of these corpulent whale bombers in a single sortie, an act of almost unbelievable heroism, but the mathematics of defeat dictated that for every 4 he destroyed, 40 or more were already in transit or rolling off the assembly line. His fanatical courage, rooted in the dying philosophy of scarcity, could only ever delay the inevitable destruction brought by the cold, overwhelming reality of American unlimited resources. The strategic air war was the final, irrefutable proof that the outcome of modern conflict was not decided by the individual soldier or the singular hero, but by the raw, unapologetic, relentless power of the factory floor, the same industrial engine that would soon deliver an unexpected, profound courtesy to a group of forgotten French women thousands of miles away. The final, deafening silence descended upon the vast, echoing shell of the Willow Run plant in the late months of Tam, 1945. A quiet more profound and authoritative than the rhythmic, concussive clamor of its wartime peak. The blinding, fluorescent-lit cathedral, which had once birthed a B-24 and Liberator every single hour, now stood mostly empty, a testament to an awe-inspiring scale of industrial mobilization that the world had never before witnessed and would never again need to match. The somber emotional tone was inescapable. The achievement of the American industrial juggernaut was undeniable. Yet every single rivet, every single sheet of aluminum, and every single day of relentless, anonymous labor had been purchased with a price measured in millions of lives transformed or extinguished across two global theaters of conflict. The workers, those anonymous figures like Eleanor who had perfected the geometry of the rivetad, were now packing their tools, transforming from laborers in the machine of destruction back into citizens of an emerging superpower, their tired movements a final, eloquent statement on the close of the most demanding stress test ever placed upon an economic system. This colossal enterprise, which had once been dismissed by the Axis engineers as a fantasy, an unapologetic military business history of unlimited resources, was now a matter of cold, unassailable fact, the ultimate statistical proof of the mathematics of abundance. The economic data revealed the terrifying, overwhelming scope of the American capacity to simply print resources and convert raw material into instruments of crushing power. Beyond the C-12,000 Liberator bombers rolled out of this single factory and its companion plants, the entirety of the American industrial mobilization had delivered figures so staggering they rendered the enemy's own output pitiful and non-comparable. The war had demanded transportation, and the American factories answered with a deluge, ultimately producing over 500,000 military vehicles and trucks, a flood of mechanical assets that ensured Private First Class Miller and his comrades never lacked for logistics, for mobility, or for their daily ration of calorically dependable food. The war had required land power, and the response was equally decisive. The United States produced nearly 40,000 OS tanks, heavy machines of war whose quantity and survivability outmatched the combined output of its enemies, transforming tank warfare from a matter of desperate maneuvers into a question of sheer, overwhelming tonnage. This capacity was not an accident of history. It was a societal choice, a fundamental difference in ideological philosophy, rooted in the geographical blessing and the economic commitment to abundance. The war merely provided the crucible, proving that the American ability to generate vast surpluses of mod steel, oil, and gasoline, the infinite barrel, was not only sustainable, but was, in fact, the most potent weapon ever conceived. The legacy of Willow Run was the permanent industrial transformation of the American economy, establishing a productive base so vast, so efficient, and so ready to convert from peace to war that it fundamentally altered the course of global politics for the next 75 years. This boundless capacity meant that the American system could afford luxuries the Axis could not conceive of: redundant armor for its fighters, limitless ammunition for its infantry, and, most profoundly, a moral abundance. Rooted in the inherent value of the individual, the system that built the 40,000 tanks was the same system that instilled the courtesy in the private who saw a ravaged prisoner and addressed her, without judgment or transactional intent, as "Ma'am." The kind scars of Willow Run were the scars of effort, sacrifice, and victory, proving definitively that material supremacy and moral dignity were, in the age of total war, functionally indivisible. The dust had long settled over the remote camp, and the grim, precise entries in Lieutenant Colonel Takamatsu's ledger were merely archival notations in the archives of a defeated, defunct empire. Years later, far across the Pacific, where than 2,700 Liberty ships had once tracked their tireless, endless routes, the French women who had endured the scarcity of soul were rebuilding their lives in a Europe buoyed by the vast, continuous resource flow of American aid. The physical scars were fading, but the memory of that moment, the shock of the unexpected courtesy from the young, anonymous American infantrymen, remained a powerful, indelible inflection point in their history. They remembered the somber expectation of contempt, the bracing for the cold, utilitarian logic of men treating them as used assets, and the seismic shift of hearing that one single profoundly respectful word, ma'am. That word, seemingly trivial, was the final, devastating, data-supported conclusion to the entire conflict. The war was never truly about the individual clash of arms, nor the pure courage of men like Major Eric Hartmann, nor the fanaticism of Colonel Takamatsu. It was decided irrevocably by the relentless, overwhelming mathematics of industrial production. The entire narrative, from the 17,000-pound weight of the Pen 47, Thunderbolt to the 1.8 billion barrels of American oil, was a technical industrial supremacy narrative, proving one fundamental, unavoidable truth. The industrial philosophy you adopt determines the moral society you become. The marked contrast was stark and final. One system, the Imperial Japanese, was built on the mathematics of scarcity, a cruel, zero-sum calculation that necessitated the conservation of every resource, leading logically and inevitably to the inventory of human shame, chronicled in the ledger. It lacked the capacity to produce both fuel and human dignity. The other system, the American industrial behemoth, was built on the mathematics of abundance, which allowed for staggering, strategic, wasteful expenditure, the avalanche of steel and lead, in the pursuit of total victory. This unlimited resources doctrine created the space, the moral abundance, that allowed a private to look past the circumstance of a ruined woman and affirm her inherent worth, addressing her with the dignity of yon, ma'am. The system that built the 12,000 on Liberator bombers was, by its very nature, compelled to value the individual dignity that the bankrupt, scarce system was forced to consume. This unavoidable truth was ratified not just by the victory, but by the overwhelming peacetime reality that followed. The final, crushing data point is the post-war industrial capacity of the United States, an engine of production so vast, so efficient, that it dwarfed the combined pre-war output of every major global power. This economic supremacy made the very notion of a conventional, sustained, third world conflict, a full-scale nation-to-nation war fought by two industrial powers, an ironic or counterintuitive scenario. The industrial might that had produced the 40,000 tanks and the 500,000 vehicles ensured that any future large-scale opponent would face the same terminal dilemma of scarcity that doomed Takamatsu and Hartmann. The technical, industrial supremacy narrative is complete, finalized by the simple, enduring memory of a single act of courtesy, a small human moment born directly from the largest industrial expenditure in human history.